Back when I made the critically acclaimed video discussing about mundane PZ2 being kinda meh, I briefly talked about the Shaaaadow Plants in said world, and how I didn't quite like them. But I don't really think I went in a lot of depth there, and I certainly didn't talk about the Shaaaadow Shaaaadow Plants either, and most of my issues with them in that video were mostly in their relation to being placed in mundane, which I think only really scratches the surface surrounding them. Shaaaadow Plants as a series of plants are one I feel aren't in the greatest spot, for a variety of reasons, a lot of which you may already understand if you have played PZ2 or its mods. They are a series of plants that, especially in terms of balancing, have been a serious issue to deal with. Plants like Duskclover and Shadowpea are plants in particular which, functionally, never really get close to being properly balanced, and Shaaaadow Plants as a whole often really feel like a system to make Duskclover stronger, instead of a system to make Shaaaadow Plants a synergetic set of plants. So, instead of complaining, let's try to create our own system instead, because that might marginally be more useful in some capacity. Maybe. But to do that, I want to cover some of the issues I have with them, and want to solve. So, let's do that. Shaaaadow Plants all function around a simple system of shadow power. Moonflower produces shadow power to all plants in a 3x3 area, and all plants in that radius gain a shadow boost for as long as Moonflower remains. It's a simple system, but one that I really feel lends itself to causing problems. Let's start with the biggest one: permanent power. Moonflowers are not especially easy to remove for the zombies, typically being deep into the defense, and being defended by the boosted plants they buff. Sure, them being removed can be catastrophic for the whole defense, and it is a weak link. But that weak link only falls when things are going terribly wrong for you in the first place, and said power has already failed you. And even if it remained, you likely still couldn't win with it. This system of power as a whole also renders most other sources almost useless. Gloomvine, Nocturne, and Concealment to an extent all produce power to plants, but all are so much more ineffective than Moonflower, which is 50 sun to power 8 plants permanently, and serves as a sun producer. One of the best in the game when fully powered, in fact. Meanwhile, all other sources cost more, have lower ranges, have a limited time they're active, or are concealment, which doesn't really do anything in this case. This means that shadow power, inherently, can't be balanced great. All sources of power are inherently terrible except for Moonflower, which is typically infallible, and lacks any significant weakness. So all Shaaaadow Plants have to be balanced around Moonflower's form of power, which means that you have to assume Shaaaadow Plants are, in most cases, always powered, and means that the inherent power gimmick only matters as much as having to bring Moonflower does, and then having to use 2 tiles to produce sun, which isn't that important when Duskclover just exists. Duskclover is the biggest consequence of Shaaaadow Plant balancing. It's seemingly designed assuming shadow power would ever be enough of a problem to hold it back, something that is clearly not true, and as a result has a far stronger shadow effect than any of the other shadow plants around it. Tripling its damage output is simply unreasonably strong, especially for a plant with 3x3 splash on each of its projectiles, rendering the only standard shadow plant ever seriously worth running alongside Moonflower. The rest are just not worth it, typically. This overall sets a precedent that shadow plants must be as powerful as Duskclover to be worth buffing. You can see this more notably with Obsidian plants. Only Shadowpea and Dragonroot are worth powering, and both of these plants gain massive boosts when powered. Macadamia Nut and Nocturne are just typically not as strong, as they have either comparatively weak powered forms, or weird effects not usually worth going for over raw damage. Other plants have their own big issues, specifically Nightshade and Shadowshroom. Nightshade's powered form isn't all too strong, and contradicts a lot with its intended purpose of being in the front. It actually loses a lot of damage by being powered this way, and while the regenerating leaves are nice, it's typically not in a great position to be powered by Moonflower while using its melee attack, which is stronger. Shadowshrew meanwhile has the absolute worst shadow form in the entire game, being fundamentally worthless with Moonflower in mind, and even at best, being an insanely niche play, requiring several plants to do the same thing as something like Hala or Cherry can do in one slot, typically in a stronger fashion. All of these issues to me are mostly caused by the same main cause, Moonflower and the way it powers plants. It being the strongest renders Shadow Power designated to one playstyle, and it makes balancing Shadow Plants far more difficult, while making their powered state ultimately free to get. And these traits, specifically, cause a lot of problems with Shadow Plants that I don't like. The plants may be conceptually cool, but I feel the real synergy doesn't come out properly due to these flaws, which to me are a bit of a problem. So, with all this in mind, let's make an alternate shadow system. A system built around a very simple premise. Shadow Power is temporary, and far more expensive to get out on the field. The first plant we should look at with changes is Moonflower. I wanted to push Moonflower to be a more extreme plant here. Its main job in this rework is to produce power, and while it can produce sun, its main job will always be to provide power. Specifically, I ended up giving it 15 seconds of power every 40 seconds, to everything in a 3x3 area. In total, one Moonflower provides 37.5% shadow power uptime, with a 175 sun cost, but also can scale its sun infinitely as more shadow plants surround it. This is a massive nerf of Moonflower overall, which does allow other power sources to be viable and interesting. Concealment no longer provides mint boost effects to plants. Instead, it functions as an instant power generator. It provides 25 seconds total shadow power, and can be placed every 40 seconds, costing 75 sun, ending up being quite cost effective. It can also be placed on top of other plants, and serves more as a traditional buffer. Its job here is to provide an alternate power source that works nicely with plants that don't like Moonflower's power. Finally, is a permanent power option, Gloomvine. Gloomvine is expensive and no longer does real damage, instead doing a light stun in a 3x3 area around it when it attacks. For 125 sun, you can permanently boost a shadow plant, and make it slightly harder to remove. This is the only real way to permanently boost a shadow plant, but it is both expensive and not effective for all shadow plants. These three plants are the core of the shadow plant rework system I devised, all of which serve as options to allow different shadow plants to pull off their effects safely and effectively. Of course, the other plants have received similar changes, so we should talk through those as well. Nightshade has been reworked to cost a little more sun, but deals triple the damage. When powered, it now has limited range, but deals its full damage within this range, and will recover leaves more rapidly. It uses the limited power up time to become far more dangerous, and is typically the best early game plant that shadow plants have, having some inherent waste stall. Dustclubber is unique, in that it's the only plant to receive 0 changes at all. Conveniently, its design is inherently perfect for a shadow system like this, now having a major weakness and hole in its downtime, while still being generally sold enough to be at least decent during the downtime. It's one of the most generally useful plants in a good combo with shadow plants, and a staple of most full shadow decks by default. Shadow P has been fully reworked, focusing far more on its stalling capabilities than it did before. It deals a damage of 1.5 times P DPS when powered, and applies a stall effect with its normal attack. When powered, it attacks far less often, retains a full PS, and has a much longer stall effect. It's 275 sun, so the most expensive of the shadow plants, which gives it a unique role amongst them, and an especially good synergy with Gloomvine. Also, strangely, I found this thing to be one of the best counters to single target threats in a full deck. So, there's that. Macadamia Nut is an instant war plant. Somehow, that's not a joke. Macadamia Nut is now far cheaper and has better stats, having 3000 HP, 75 sun, with 15 seconds recharge. The main trick is that the goo HP is a full 4000, giving it almost the HP of a tall nut in total, in addition to some light chip damage. It's designed for concealment abuse, and when not powered, it recovers goo instantly to max out for the next power session. It's really solid with concealment in mind, allowing you to suddenly shore apart the field for a long duration if needed. Shadow Stream is the last plant which I attempted to do something with, though admittedly not much can be done to fix it. Its powered form has been buffed to also provide a strong slowdown effect, a long slide slightly reduced damage, so it's more likely to chain onto other targets. It's not enough to make the shadow form good, but it gives it some additional utility with concealment, and Shadow Stream has a role in some shadow decks as a good counter to zombies like Newspaper. There are a few plants dotted here that I want to also talk about, before we head on to the conclusive discussion of how the system as a whole plays. Firstly, Grimrose. I haven't removed it outright, but I consider it outside the system, mostly for a few technical issues. Firstly, the way the power system works is a single pulse Moonflower provides every 40 seconds. It's not a constant effect for 15 seconds, which means Grimrose would need to be placed as Moonflower is about to activate in order to get the effect at all. Aside of Moonflower, I find the idea of an insta that needs another insta-like effect to activate kinda redundant, and it doesn't provide an extremely powerful effect, just as likely to run out of power halfway than it is to get the full series of attacks off. Next, Dragon Brute is absent. This is partially because it's not in the version I was modding, but also I have too many issues with this plan to just add into a project like this. It has a lot of overlap with Dustlobber, as it's a plant that attacks in 3 lanes, with a unique ability to turn into free plants that are placed at random tiles when destroyed. Dragon Brute is a mess of a plant, though I feel you could do something with making the smaller heads limited range, and making them ground plants like Spikeweed is. We shall not find out today, at any rate. Finally, Nocturne, which is technically not absent. For some reason, due to either P-Vine or Nocturne, a core piece of code changed where for some reason, plant buffs would pulse out buffs when any plant is placed, anywhere on the field. Regardless, I ended up turning the role he would have played into Concealment, which was originally going to be board wide. I figured having a plant to perform the role Nocturne was going to was more important than Concealment's original. Now that these changes are listed, let's move on to a more interesting aspect. How these actually play, what these changes end up fixing, and the issues remaining with them. Firstly, I have a final.ob in my Discord server, if you so wish to play with these changes and come to your own conclusions. It's not necessary, but it will help you understand what I am saying here a bit better. The main thing that I succeeded at is adding more nuance to how shadow plants work. It's not uncommon for multiple power sources to be able to stack together in the same deck, and you definitely have to make use of a burst of power when you can. Plants like Dustlobber, Shadow Pea, and Macadamia Nut feel really good to use, and I think they are all genuinely super fun plants to play now, as compared to normal where they are very auto. In terms of power, I think Gloomvine is definitely maybe a bit strong. These plants are definitely not designed for permanent power, so it, combined with Nightshade especially, can get absurdly strong. But this could have been fixed by changing Nightshade's fire rate. I decided to not care too much about in-depth balancing, at least for now. Otherwise, the other options seem far more balanced against each other. I feel that there is a lot more reason to run all the shadow plants now, but they definitely aren't something you can slap and forget about, and some are definitely weaker than others. It's hard to utilize Shadow Pea's niche as a staller outside of just spamming more Shadow Peas, meanwhile Shadow Stream is just unsalvageable without a far more significant rework, which simply does not work in the context of these changes. Shadow Stream is probably the most fundamentally stupid shadow plant in terms of ability, so this isn't much of a surprise, but it's still a shame. Moving on, this system makes shadow decks far more fragile, which is both an upside and a downside. There is a lot of things that can go wrong with shadow plants now. Ambushes can pose serious issues. Shadow plants seriously lack any single target damage worth running home about, as far as side attackers go, meaning that anything of high HP getting close can spell your downfall fast. Shadow decks are also far more expensive here, and I feel they're incompatible with a lot of objectives. I wouldn't run one into a don't lose X plants level for instance, and I have suspicion that spend less on X Sun objectives are going to be a serious problem. Another big downside, this system needs a lot of plants to be available for it to mean all too much. This does not work in vanilla systems without a heavy rework of plant unlock location, and giving modern day more plants to unlock than any other world, with Shaaaadow Plants only truly being great after a lot have been unlocked. This system is also definitely more complex to field compared to basically anything in vanilla. It's good fun if you understand it, but it's definitely out there compared to simply spamming plants like Repeater or Wintermelon. It's a confusing system that would also need a more robust and normal implementation than the one I've done if it were to be official feeling in any real capacity. This combined with its weaker overall power makes me feel that in a purely casual mindset, the original system might be superior overall. It's far more clean, easier to understand, and feels more immediately punchy and satisfying to use. But I feel in the wider scheme of things I do prefer this alternative system. It's really distinct and makes playing of Shaaaadow Plants feel super unique. I like how it turns Shaaaadow Plants into more of an actual thing and a strategy to go for, rather than a set of plants with a gimmick that matters so little. For me, that was always the point of these changes, so I think in spite of the downsides, I'm happy with how the version ended up. It's not strictly better, but it fixes the issues I personally have with Shaaaadow Power, so that is functionally a success in my eyes. What, did you think I was superior to the game developers and knew better? Ha, no. My opinion and thoughts are not inherently superior to anyone else's, and to be real here, whoever designed the original Shaaaadow Power system, it likely has more experience than I do in the field. There are plenty of reasons why the Shaaaadow system isn't the way I made it, and while it is cool this way, I think the system being more complex is to its own downfall on a larger scale. Still, on a smaller scale for people like me, who prefer the more technical aspects of our strategy games, I like it. And you may like it too. Or you may not. That's why decisions are decisions, eh? Yes, it's a whole elaborate way to go, no, just because I prefer something doesn't make it better in other ways. But I think this is honestly a very important lesson on the nature of mods in general. PZ2 mods typically are not straight improvements on a system. They are alternate takes, made for specific people. Even PZ2 Reflourished, a mod so similar to vanilla you could often use its fudge interchangeably with vanillas, still has different takes on some elements of PZ2. How it creates its levels, how it paces its content, even how they approach things like expansions in general, for instance. That's kinda how most design is. There's always an alternate way to do something. The final choice of what precisely you want to do is ultimately down to which elements you consider more important to concepts. If PopCap wanted Shaaaadow Plants to be a more complex system, then it'd have made them more complex. I think it's easy to lose sight of the fact that things typically are the way they are for reasons we don't immediately know or notice. Such as me having to end the video here, that might be somewhat obvious by the circumstances. This has been a fun video and, honestly, I wouldn't be against making more videos like this in the future. So let me know if you'd be interested in me going over things in PZ2 to improve them, like I did here. Regardless, this has been Creeps, and have a good one.